Good morning. I'm Bob Cusack, the editor-in-chief of The Hill, and The Hill is excited to be hosting this morning's discussion sponsored by Visa. In addition to our audience here at the museum, we are live streaming at thehill.com. And if you're interested in engaging in the discussion, please follow at The Hill Events on Twitter and comment using the hashtag #TheHillTechForum. Great panel today. Katie Bowe-Williams, who covers cybersecurity. She's going to be moderating a lot of the discussion today. And she'll be chatting with Congressman Polis, who I'm going to introduce. He was first elected to represent Colorado's 2nd Congressional District in 2008. He serves on the Rules Committee, the Committee on Education and the Workforce, and the Committee on Natural Resources. He's a successful entrepreneur. And as evidenced by his performance in Will on the Hill last night, he's a very good actor. Please welcome Katie Bowe-Williams and Congressman Polis.
Good morning, everybody. And Congressman, thank you so much for being here with me this morning.
A pleasure.
Well, let's start. Tell me a little bit about the Open Source Caucus. You're obviously one of the founding members of that group. What are some of the sort of goals of that caucus, and what do you see as kind of the pathway to accomplishing them?
Well, it's a bipartisan caucus that I put together with Blake Farenthold, who I think will be here later today. Really based on the realization that members of Congress didn't have as high a level of awareness about open source issues as they should, and it helps shine a light on the work that the open source community is doing across the country and how critical it is to have policies that support open source to continue economic growth. Really, we also wanted to help Congress serve as a poster child for innovation by bringing open source technologies into the legislative process to increase transparency and increase efficiency. And we've held a number of briefings with our colleagues on open source issues.
Well, talk to me a little bit about some of the sort of main benefits to the business community with this kind of technology. You know, how can startups leverage open source in a way to sort of build a successful business?
Open source really helps increase the rate of innovation by helping new innovation get leverage based on existing innovation. So if you're a coder looking to create a new app or a new program, you might very well find open source banks of code that fulfill many of the functions, and you're able to effectively, rather than create them from scratch, plug them in and then add in whatever it is you're doing to finalize it. It really allows for customizability, for adaptability. It encourages innovation when you have an open source platform. And it really can lead to greater innovation than having a closed technology where only a group of people, maybe with one company or licensed to a handful of companies, can do development.
How does that impact consumers?
Well, it impacts all of us here. Imagine, for a moment, if there's a world with no open source. First of all, if you're using an Android, you wouldn't be able to use that. That's an open source technology. Of course, I'm sure you all use Linux and Unix computers at home. Nobody runs Windows anymore, right? So I know I do. So you wouldn't be able to run your Unix computers at home. But seriously, open source is incorporated into so many aspects of our life, and when we, even elements of it, are usually incorporated into systems that are more closed and proprietary, and people are always trying to open them up. I mean, there's even a discussion of how do we do an open source like automobile? How do we open it up so people can kind of hack and go in and change things around, and how do we deal with any liability issues that come out of that?
Well, I was going to actually kind of jump into some of the privacy questions there. I mean, there's sort of got to be some privacy and security questions with the use of this kind of technology. How do you go about protecting consumers?
I wouldn't say that the issues are any different than they are with proprietary technologies. I mean, you could argue with the proprietary technology, you obviously put a whole lot of weight of responsibility on, let's say, one company that runs the standard. It could be a Microsoft or an Apple, basically, who we're talking about. When you have open source, you don't have one player that kind of knows everything and controls the ecosystem. So you have a lot of different players. So sort of the risk of some sort of catastrophic privacy violation is obviously lower, but there's certainly a lot more players on the field, and they're all kind of equal in some sense.
I mean, how do you sort of go about setting a standard for that would end up protecting users of this kind of technology?
Well, if you're talking about privacy, we do that in law, and we need to do that better in law. I'm a sponsor of, for instance, the Student Privacy Act that deals with data that kids enter while they're on campuses at school. But in general, we need to have the right legal framework around making sure that people control their own information, and that is not limited to open source. That's also proprietary technologies, any type of subscription technology, really anything that people are doing. They ought to be in the driver's seat with regard to knowledge and consent of how their information is and isn't being used.
What about adoption? How widely adopted has this technology been? Are there any sort of barriers that have kind of hampered businesses who are like trying to take advantage of open source?
I think many businesses that are trying to take advantage of open source would cite the patent system as inhibiting the further growth and development of the open source ecosystem. But certainly any coders, developers, all familiar with using open source code. Many contribute back to open source banks. Anybody who's familiar with 3D printing is usually part of an open source ecosystem. And as I said, anybody here who might use an Android or Unix or a wide variety of things without even really realizing it, we all really employ open source in so many ways.
Has the regulatory environment sort of kept up with the technology here?
A lot of open source kind of develops. When generally in the regulatory environment, the area that comes to mind is intellectual property with regard to open source. And a lot of open source are developed in a way consistent with our current intellectual property regime under, for instance, something that's called Creative Commons license, which is consistent with our current copyright law. Also, people will make it essentially completely open source or no intellectual property protections. There are ways it clashes from time to time with both copyright and patent. It certainly can exist alongside of it, but there's also examples of times that it's been inhibited because of our legacy intellectual property protection systems.
Let's talk about sort of fostering innovation in this area. How does government, this is kind of the biggie, how does government create a framework that kind of promotes the growth of this kind of technology in a way that's both usable and safe?
Well, that's one of the areas that we work on through the Open Source Caucus. In addition, I've launched a Startup Day Across America concept several years ago. So on August 4th, we're going to have several dozen members of Congress, it's bipartisan, bicameral, who visit with startup disruptive companies in their districts to show that this concept of startup companies is not really limited to just Silicon Valley or Boulder or Boston, but it's really in every congressional district across the country, and making that connection between policymakers and the innovation economy is critical to get policymakers talking about the kinds of issues and reforms that are necessary for economic growth. An example of applying kind of the open source concept to a public policy goal. We've all heard about the rising cost of college. If you're a parent of a college kid, you've experienced that. If you were recently in college, you also experienced that. And one of those very costly items are textbooks. And in fact, average textbook costs on top of tuition are over $1,200 per year, usually out of pocket for the student. And so by moving to open source textbooks, and we have a bill to encourage that, and we've been working with colleagues on both sides of the aisle to move in that direction, you can effectively disintermediate and get better quality content, dynamically updated content that's open source to students to function as a textbook. It can still be physically printed if somebody wants a physical textbook. We're not talking about the digital versus physical divide, but the cost of physically printing a book might be $8 or $10 instead of $200, which is what one of these textbooks might cost. So that's an example of applying open source platform to actually meet a public policy goal of making college more affordable.
How difficult has it been to kind of I guess I would say educate here in this area. I mean, it's sort of from a technology perspective, it's kind of a tough thing to get your hands around if you're not a tech person. How hard has it been to kind of get, I guess, stakeholder buy-in to, like, this is something that we need to do, this is a valuable tool?
Yeah, I mean, it shouldn't be that hard. And open source companies are touching so many more of us every day in so many ways. There's companies in my district like Aleph Objects, which makes Lulzbot, a 3D printing company, which is open source. And as I mentioned, I mean, if you're a college student, have the opportunity to buy an open source textbook, and just for the cost of printing it for $10 instead of $250, you can kind of understand what it means. But at the basic level, it basically means sharing information without a financial adjustment for rights, because the entire ecosystem's benefits from being able to share information and build upon a common open source platform. So that's why it's so exciting. And it's not a very difficult concept to understand. People deal with the sort of the dichotomy between proprietary platforms and open platforms every day in a variety of ways.
What are some of the challenges in kind of, if you have obviously a lot of different systems here, like what are some of the challenges in getting these systems to be interoperable? That's obviously got to be sort of a big issue in terms of adoption and spread of the technology.
And I would say, however big a problem it is, it's probably even bigger for proprietary systems. Yeah. But certainly there could exist several parallel open source platforms that are not interoperable. I think a closed and proprietary platform is, by its very nature, not interoperable with other platforms. If they open it up with APIs, they're moving in the continuum sort of towards being considered open source. Many proprietary systems inevitably do that. But at some point, they're kind of this hybrid between an open and a closed system.
I know you've got sort of a lot of open source businesses in your district. Can you tell me about some of sort of the more exciting and interesting ways that you're seeing people leverage this technology? Yeah,
we do. We have, as I mentioned, Lulzbot, 3D printing. Every 3D printer is completely open source. The plans and how to make it are on the internet. You can buy it from them or make it yourself. We have another company that sells open source computer chips that are designed by people, and again, you can design them yourself or order from them. So we have a lot of exciting interest in the innovation economy in the 2nd Congressional District of Colorado, and many of the companies employ open source, even if that's not their entire value proposition. They certainly deploy open source in reaching their goals and building value.
As the innovation economy sort of continues to grow, I can't help but imagine that the sort of technological environment is going to the landscape is going to look completely different, next year or even the year after that. And we're obviously going to have a new administration in at that time. What kinds of sort of emerging issues are our new administration going to have to sort of deal with coming down the pike in this area?
Well, the issue of intellectual property and how our intellectual property system applies to a 21st century economy, to a shared economy, will not go away and will only get bigger. And as we try to apply kind of our 19th and 20th century intellectual property protection system, largely focused on mechanical and physical innovation, to a 21st century economy where the bulk of the value of innovation is biological and digital, we're going to continue to have these problems. And there are different issues around biological intellectual property protection and digital, but I think we owe it to the spirit of innovation in our country to update our intellectual property protection protocols to account for the value growth in these new sectors. Our system of patents and so forth still works fine for mechanical innovation. Mechanical innovation will always be there. People will always be trying to build a better mousetrap, and that's wonderful, and by and large we should leave that alone. But as it applies to digital and biological, these are frontiers that when the patent law was last majorly updated a century ago, were not even on the horizon.
Can you give me an example of an area where that's kind of created tension in the technological world that regulatory framework doesn't line up with the needs of today?
Well, it's created a tension all over. I mean, whether it's the overhang from what are called patent trolls, or folks that may effectively have patented some form of code or algorithm that may or may not be used by others. It's a kind of cost on a lot of startups as well as established companies. We hear, of course, from our friends in various industries that both the time frame that it takes, and as you know, patents can take 3-4 years to get, the life cycle of a digital product might be over in months. So by the time intellectual property protection even enters the picture, the economic life cycle of the product is over.
So how are you seeing companies sort of navigate that challenge today? And how do you see that sort of changing going forward?
Well, I think many tech companies are obviously not fans of the current patent system. They kind of take two paths. Some of them just ignore it altogether, don't bother with it, don't really believe in patents and don't file them. Others try to sort of assemble arsenals, which are presumably defensive arsenals that are kind of mutually assured destruction should any other company sort of seek a battle royale throwdown match with them on IP and patents.
Well, Congressman, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me. Next up, we're going to have our sponsor perspective. So if we can please welcome Mark Jameson, Visa's Senior Vice President of Global New Product Design, to the stage. Congressman, again, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. Absolutely.
Appreciate it.
Happy Tuesday morning, everyone. I flew in late last night from San Francisco, so if I start to slur words, you'll know why. Over the next few minutes, I'm going to attempt to do three things and hopefully have some fun in the process. Number one is give you some context for how we see the open platform ecosystem working. Number two, talk about how a big company like Visa reacts to that and how we operate in that world. And then three, give you an applied example of what that might look like. So why don't I just jump in? I think there's three big things that we see happening in today's world. Number one is consumers are interacting with the world in a completely different way. Right? They're consuming content in completely different ways. They're buying things, they're searching for things in a different way, they're paying for things in a different way. Right? The whole commerce ecosystem has radically changed. That's number one. Number two is that with the whole technology infrastructure that now exists in the Internet of Things, commerce is now being embedded in completely new and different ways. Right? So think about Uber. Right? You get in a car, you go somewhere, you get out. Right? There's a payment involved in that, but yet you just get out of a car and walk away. Right? So there's contextual commerce that's happening, and it will be embedded in virtual reality using embedded intelligence, also smart contracts using blockchain. So commerce is going to be embedded everywhere, including places like your television, perhaps your washing machine, perhaps your car. Right? So think about the Internet of Things and anything that can be smart. So that's the second thing. And the third thing we see happening, particularly in the fintech space, is there's been massive amounts of venture investment against innovation. Right? So the new forms of interfaces and the applications that are being built to help people be smarter with their money is now being powered by massive amounts of venture capital and is creating a huge amount of innovation in the system. So if you take those three things together and say, great, Visa is the world's largest payments and commerce network in the world, right? What might that mean for us? So why don't we just sort of jump into this? So first, let's just talk about APIs. Right? So these have become the connective tissue of the whole digital ecosystem. Right? So these are just some examples of the number of API calls every day these companies get. The Netflix gets 5 billion. I don't know if you think of Netflix as a platform, but indeed they are. Right? They're just serving content through a set of APIs. And during prime time in North America, they're a third of all internet traffic is at Netflix, right? And it's being served through these APIs. When you use Uber and there's a map that shows where your car is, they're just consuming the Google Maps API, right? When you log in using Facebook to some commerce site, you're just using a Facebook, it's called OAuth, is the name of the API that says, yeah, this is really Mark Jameson and he wants to log in here. And it makes a lot of sense to do that because the commerce site has two choices. They could either build an entire login flow with username and password. Oh, and by the way, what happens when someone forgets their password and they need to reset it and they need to call someone, right? So they could set up all that infrastructure and cost, or they could just consume the Facebook OAuth API and it's done, right? So that's sort of the logic. Matter of fact, if you talk to the folks at Uber, what they'll tell you is that 70% of all of their code in production isn't their own. They're just consuming different APIs from different places, right? So they consume the Google Maps API. For the payment, it actually ends up, it's Braintree's set of APIs. So the biggest one here is, not surprising, Amazon. 25 billion API calls per day, like massive amounts of interaction with the digital ecosystem. So if you think about a place like VisaNet, so VisaNet is our collection of software and services. So every time you swipe a card, you dip a card, you tap your phone to pay, it runs across VisaNet. So VisaNet was built and started in the late 50s. In that time, it has never been down once. It has never been hacked in any way, shape, or form, right? And the reason why you can get that is because you had what was a really tightly closed proprietary system, right? But the world's not working that way now. Right? What we've seen is the winning model is actually open systems that open up the edges of their networks through secure APIs. So in the case of Visa, we have this thing called Visa Developer Platform, where we've taken core capabilities and we build them out as APIs in a RESTful format. And we allow other companies to use those. So here are some examples you may not know. If you're on Facebook and you use Instant Messenger, they have a little $ you can send person-to-person payments. On the back end, that actually is a Visa API called Visa Direct, and that allows you to send money in real time to anyone. If you've used Visa Checkout on United Airlines website or on Under Armour or in Starbucks, right? That actually is a set of APIs for Visa Checkout. Or another one you might not know is Apple Pay. So if you use Apple Pay or any of the other pays, Samsung Pay, Android Pay, and you go and you tap and you pay, what has actually happened is on your device, they have provisioned a set of digital tokens which basically secure your account number, and that's Visa on the back end. So that's the benefits of once you start to take your capabilities and build them out as APIs and let third parties consume them, what can happen? The reason why I throw up this slide is to give you a sense of perspective of how much the world has changed. So this is it's amazing. I'm sure everyone in this room has a card, a Visa card in their pocket, right? This card started in 1958, I think was the first one. And actually the numbers that are embossed on it, it was modeled after a military dog tag. So there's some worthless trivia for you. And it was called Bank of America card. It was in Fresno, California. And that was in 1958. And think about it, here we are in 2016. All of us still have this same form factor, right? And it's amazing what a workhorse this has been, right? Still has the numbers. We've added this magnetic stripe on the back. We've added this chip to make it smarter and more secure. We kind of have a number of other things like the CVV code. But at the end of the day, like, what's my balance? It doesn't seem to be working. Send money to my brother. Right? So here we are, 2016, and we have all these amazing capabilities, right? And if you were to build this today, would you build it in this form factor? Of course you wouldn't, right? So where's the world going? It's going to much smarter, where basically this is becoming software, right? So in our case, in the series of the evolution of our company, we said, great, I think that in the history of the company, what we launched in 2016, which is take VisaNet, open it up as a set of APIs, like that is one of the transformational things that's happening that will enable and accelerate innovation throughout the entire commerce ecosystem. So the framework goes from made by Visa to enabled by Visa. And this is the winning model. Like you see this, when I first started in the fintech space in the late 90s, the model was, and many of you will remember this, it was you want to be a portal, right? Every media company wanted to be a portal. There was Excite and Lycos and Alta Vista and Yahoo. Everyone was going to be a portal. That was the dominant strategy, right? But it ended up that wasn't the one that won. In this whole evolutionary economics environment that we live in, the creative destruction, what is it, the famous quote, the gale of creative destruction. What ended up happening was platforms, open platforms were the thing that won, right? So Facebook is just a platform with a set of APIs. Android, just a platform. iOS, just a platform. And I say just a platform, but yet they have this thing called the App Store. If you actually looked at their last quarter, about $4 billion of their profit was basically at a 100% margin. It was revenue from apps that someone else built on their platform that they just take a 30% cut at Apple, right? Pretty good business model if you can get in it. And there tends to be one platform that wins in each space, and we believe that Visa is that platform in payments. So in order to have a platform, there's sort of three things you need. Number one, you need a set of products and services that people want. Number two is you actually have to have a dev center that engineers can go in and get the right content. They have SDKs, meaning, hey, just copy this snippet of code, put it into your own application, change a variable name, you're good to go. Right? And then the third thing is actually having real test data so you can actually learn how this thing works before you put it into production. And so we actually think of this as the minimum viable ecosystem that you need to be successful in this space. So this is an example of some of the APIs. We actually have about 160 different API sets that are available today. We're adding more. And this probably is things you would expect. There's a set of payment things like Visa Checkout, Visa Direct. There's a whole set of risk and security and fraud products that exist. And then there's a whole set of data and analytics set of products that exist. So this is the last piece, which is meant to be the funner piece. So I want to give you just a sort of it's a little trivial, but it's also sort of interesting to say how this play out. So we launched this dev platform. We said we should eat our own dog food. And like many companies, and I suspect everyone in the room has some experience with an executive somewhere saying, we have to have a millennial strategy. We said, great, let's take a team of millennials and give them some engineers and some designers, and give them 72 hours to run a hackathon, do a series of sprints, and what would they build? We said, hey, millennials, if you were to build an app using all this stuff that allows you to be smarter with your money, what would it look like? And they came up with this concept called Finstagram, right? So financial and Instagram, Finstagram. And this was just basically it. It was an app this happened to be an Android app. And so here's the use case. So Mark is a millennial. He's from Canada. He comes to the United States. And when he lands in the United States, the app is smart enough using mobile location, geolocation, it says, hey, welcome to the United States. Here's the exchange rate. You should turn on, first of all, do you want to do commerce in this country? Yes. So there's a button you can say, great, now don't decline purchases while I'm in the United States, made in the United States. Do you want to get some money? Sure. Touch, and up comes, it's a mashup with Google Maps, and it shows you all the ATMs that you could walk to get out local currency. Great. So then you go somewhere, you want to buy something, what do? Well, you want to tap to pay, and it uses a whole set of tokenization to make sure that payment is secure. And because you're millennials, when you buy something, what do you want to do? You need to take a picture. So then you would take a selfie of yourself with your latte or whatever it happens to be. That shows up in your feed. You can see some pictures there. And it was just this really interesting, simple app that over the course of 72 hours, that's the whole point of APIs, right? Is that there's a set of building blocks, or like Legos, you can just sort of pull in the capabilities that you want, right? So I know this is sort of a trivial example. It was super fun. We just did this a few weeks ago with some of our millennial employees. But I think it gives you a sense for the speed and agility that open platforms can give you as you look to grow your business, and in our case, to help our clients be better, faster, and smarter in the way that they grow their business. So I hope this was helpful. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Mark. At this time, I'm going to invite a couple of speakers out onto the stage. Following their brief presentations, we're going to sit down together for a quick discussion. First, we have Margaret Shepard, Managing Director for 1776. Welcome, Margaret. And then following Margaret, we will have Morgan Reed, who is the Executive Director at ACT, the App Association. Margaret, if you want to take us along.
Absolutely. Is this thing on? Okay, yes. I am going to talk down here because I need to see my slides. So how many of you have heard of 1776 before? Okay, so some of you. So those of you who aren't familiar, 1776 is a global incubator and seed fund based here in Washington, D.C. Our premise, our thesis, is that startups are poised to disrupt the most highly regulated industries that we have in the globe. So healthcare, energy, education, smart cities, all of these are fairly complex, highly regulated, fairly difficult, and are ready to be disrupted by innovators and startups across the country and across the world. So I'll start you with a parochial slide here. This is just economics 101. The digital technology has been around for us for a long time, right? In addition, like in the beginning, digital technology addressed the easy problems. These are, the simple sort of accessibility problems or whatever. all of those have really been finished. And so what we're left with is the hard problems. These are global, complex. They involve governments. They involve entrenched actors. They are, highly difficult, but they also offer an opportunity for real innovation, for breaking apart the system and rebuilding it in a more efficient and interesting way. So we call this regulatory hacking, and that is really growth hacking plus public affairs. And that's really the reason why 1776 is based in Washington. We are the seat of government here, so it gives us the best opportunity to marry that startup innovation with this space to make sure that we're actually connecting the right people to create that change. So it's a fairly simple concept, but actually one that's really hard for startups to navigate, because I'm sure all of you know who've seen startups in your offices, startups and Washington don't speak the same language. So we are there in the middle to help actually make that, bridge those connections and speak a common language. So the ultimate regulatory hacker, obviously some of you know Elon Musk. He is thought of definitely as an entrepreneur, but he also is a regulatory hacker. He, in all of his work, whether it's Tesla, whether it's SolarCity, whether it's his work on Hyperloop or his most recent work with SpaceX, all of that, in the space case, his biggest client is the US government. So he has been able to find an innovation, break apart the system, navigate all of the internal workings of the space industry, and create a product that is usable, that is attractive to the US government, and that they're willing to pay for. So what should you do? There are several actors who are involved in this sort of conversation and process, right? There's the startups, there's the entrenched institutions, and then there's the government. So if you're a startup founder, it's pretty easy. Find a hard problem and solve it. And that sounds very trivial, but it's not as hard as you think. And many of the businesses that are members of ours are actually doing this on a day-to-day basis, and I can bring up some examples when we get in the conversation later. So after you solve a hard problem, you need to learn a new playbook. Part of the reason why these industries are so stagnant is because they've not been thought through another way, in another discipline for quite some time. So looking at how things are running, how things are functioning, and rethinking it, reinventing it. And the startups and the innovators and the entrepreneurs who are in these spaces are really the ones to do that. If you're entrenched in government, you know how hard it is to rethink and reinvent. So you need outside perspectives to do that. And build your ecosystem. This is really about connections and networks. So you cannot just be a startup and be on your own. You have to be able to understand who are the people that are most important in your space, who are the people you should be connecting with to make your startup grow. If you're an institution, these are the entrenched actors. These are the existing partners. You need to be aware of the opportunities that are out there, and you need to avoid these threats. And so many of our partners, actually broader partners at 1776, are there for that very reason. They want to understand how they're going to be disrupted, who is coming for them, what are the pieces of the industry that are most ripe for change, so that they can be a part of the process and not be left behind. So, and this gets to the open data piece, open your own innovation ecosystem. So giving startups and innovators and entrepreneurs access to your systems is going to be infinitely helpful in maintaining relevance as an institution. So it's something you should think about. And finally, if you're a policymaker, which is probably relevant for many of you who work on the Hill and other places, engage with the entire ecosystem. Again, this is building a network, understanding who's at play, understanding how policy plays a role, and really focusing on bringing those conversations together and creating change. So with that, I will turn it over to my colleague, Morgan.
Thank you very much. I'll try to see if I can see from up here. So my name is Morgan Reed, and I am the Executive Director of the App Association. How many of you have a smartphone? Show of hands. Thank you. You all help keep me employed. Our membership includes over 5,000 companies that build all the apps that you love, the ones that you use every day, the ones that hopefully you use more often than for over 2 weeks, and the ones that change the way you integrate with your friends, your families, your banks, your car, your healthcare, your everything. I'm going to talk a little bit today about open data and the idea that the government is an amazing repository of information that is locked up in a way that harms our ability to make the kinds of change and impact that we all want. And hopefully, it's a problem that we can solve without the intractable problem of legislation, merely through finding new ways for the government to express itself through open APIs, better data sets, and to expand the universe that they live in. So a little bit of level setting. We do a series of reports on the app economy. Right now, it's about $120 billion, but there's a really important factor for those of us in Washington. 82% of the top apps are not built in Silicon Valley. 82% are not. They're built in the other 434 congressional districts that spread across this country. In fact, we have member companies in every single congressional district. So there is this concept out there that Silicon Valley is the only place that good ideas come from, and I'm here to tell you that it's not. $120 billion economy everywhere in the United States, and even more interesting, exports. We export apps to the rest of the world. We are the leader when it comes to financial services. We are the leader when it comes to all those products, and we have traction overseas. So not only are we building an economy here in the United States, but we are the next step forward in ensuring that the United States continues to have the kind of presence in the technology sphere it has. So we release our State of the App Economy report, and as we've been looking, we've been trying to figure out, what's the next big thing? Where are the regulatory hacks? Where are the areas in which we have opportunity to really make big growth? Well, we have a couple of areas that are really holding us up. One is access to talent. There are currently between 300 and 600,000 jobs that are not filled right now. 600,000 jobs that aren't filled because we cannot find qualified developers. And so we did an experiment with government open data, and we looked at what we could try to find out about this and see what the problem was. So we have a report coming out that pulled data from BLS, from economics, from Statistics Administration, from ESA, from Census Bureau, and interestingly enough, we looked at high schools. And what we found is right now in the United States, it is more likely that your high school will offer a class in AP Latin than it will have a class in computer science. And in fact, only 1 in 8 schools has a computer science program in the congressional district. So when you consider the tens of thousands of points of data that we were able to pull down, we actually took this and we mapped over it the number of jobs that are currently open and not filled. We took that government data, we took data from jobs and opportunities, and we were able to paint a picture. And what we see with this is not only does it create an opportunity for a company to say, hey, there's a need that needs to be filled, but it's also a way to present information to regulators in a way that they might understand. I can show Congressman Farenthold, although I will say it's a funny because both Polis and Farenthold have districts that have outside the norm number of computer science classes, outside of the norm in terms of jobs filled. In fact, in Polis's district, there are 6,300 software programming jobs that are currently filled. In Farenthold's districts, 2/3 of all of his high schools have computer science programs. We're able to take that, we're able to take the data, the open data sets, and we're able to show that, and able to go to a district and say, you have 4,000 jobs unfilled in this congressional district, and you don't have a CS class. Let's work together. Let's find a way to bring in a teacher. Let's find a way to bring in a mentor from an incubator or a mentor who's already been successful in the app economy. So what we've learned is there's a way to merge government data with the policy issues that we all face every day. And it's not just our clever thing of hacking and looking at schools. It's actually a lot of the apps that you use every day that rely on government data and open APIs. Now, there are significant problem sets. George Mason just did a review and found that even though data.gov is great, a huge percentage of the data that it has is only available in PDF, which those of you who work with PDF every day know how useless that is. So I want to think of it as a glass half full. I'm an optimistic guy, but it's more like a teacup, and we're looking at a beer stein. So a huge amount of government data that can be used to populate your weather app, your driving app, your real estate information, everything that you do in your daily life, the government is collecting data, whether it's census or otherwise, and it's a way that can give you a better ability to make a decision. And so when we talk about hacking regulation, open data and access to better data from the government is an important feature. And the reality is that we have three areas that I think that we're going to face a monumental challenge on when it comes to how do we bring this data in, how do we do it. I'm looking around the room, I see a few of you who are probably into the age set where you have to think about your latter years. But for those of you who are younger, just think of this reality. Your parents are going to be living in your basement unless we figure out a way to solve the problem with our current healthcare system. Right now, we spend $3 trillion on healthcare, $900 billion of it goes through CMS, and in about 30 years, 20 to 30 years, when your parents are over 65, a third of Americans will be over the age of 65. We literally do not have enough places to have assisted living facilities for those people. If we don't find a way to bring technology into that, to hack the regulatory sphere, to make it possible to have a wearable that keeps track of mom's medication, or to have a wearable around the neck that allows mom to know, that allows you to know if mom fell down, or if dad hasn't eaten today, or if you have a parent who kind of loses their way, where are they? What's their location? If we don't have that technology and the government doesn't bring it in, then we are facing a monumental crisis in terms of billions of dollars. So when we're looking at these questions of hacking the government, hacking regulation, think of it in three categories. We need the data to make good decisions, so we need better open data. And then we need regulations that allow us to solve the problem through the technology that we're all working to develop. And finally, we need to make sure that we're educating the next generation so they can build these amazing tools and keep America where we are today as a leader in this space. Thank you.
We like to conscript our speakers around here to do all the heavy lifting. Well, Morgan, welcome back to the stage. Thanks so much for taking some time to talk to me today. Let's start by talking about sort of the value of open source. What are kind of some of the more exciting and innovative things that you guys have seen coming down the pipeline?
Well, I think as I was expressing, I think the question of open source, I think what I'm more intrigued by and what we see more action happening is around open data and open APIs. The reality is that our industry has inculcated the concepts of sharing, as we heard from his excellent presentation, already into our daily lives. So now it's really a question of how do we free up that data in a way that allows us to keep value, allows us to create excellent startups that are economically successful, and yet still interact. So I see the real revolution is happening on the open API, open data set.
I mean, we're seeing a ton of innovation, obviously, through our membership. We just welcomed several thousand people last week for our Challenge Festival. We had 65 global startups competing for seed funding, and among them were Washington-based Transit Screen, which helps with the current metro crisis that is happening in Washington, D.C. that I'm sure everybody is familiar with.
I was going to say, is that going to get me to work faster? No.
It does enable you to actually sort of look at all of the transportation options at a particular moment. It gathers all of that data. You have it all on a screen. So if you take the metro and the metro's backed up, you can get a bus and you know exactly when that bus is coming. And they have a great story about there's a transit screen in Chicago that's outside of a Starbucks, and it has actually created a lot of volume for Starbucks because people will go in and say, well, I looked at the transit screen and the L isn't coming, so I'm going to go grab a coffee.
Get a cup of coffee.
And instead of waiting on the platform and wait inside. So, those are sort of interesting, fun innovations that are happening amongst our membership.
Well, going back to the data question, I mean, the government is this huge repository of data. That's right. What are some of the ways that those data sets can be used if they were open available? What are the use cases here?
Well, I think as I was talking about, it's everything from how you make a decision about what house you buy to what you pointed out. All the data sets that have to be drawn into that come from local and federal government. The bus routes, the timing on it. Somebody has to have a tie-in. There has to be an open API at WMATA that you can tie in to see what train's down. So in your daily life, in your daily commute, the access to data is critical. But on the larger scale, which is, I think one thing you said, which is identify a hard problem and solve it, data is a critical aspect of that. So getting the government to provide information on, say, where there are job openings or where there is an area where there is a need that needs to be filled is something that we have a problem with. I think a good example is just how woeful we are when it comes to figuring out the state of our unemployment. You know, BLS comes out with the statistics, then the industry really pays far more attention to the data out of ADP, which is the one that pushes everybody's check out. Mm-hmm. It shows that the government is losing out on that data to create a better picture of our economic opportunity and where we may be letting folks down. So I think it's a critical aspect to making good decisions when you come to building a startup.
I totally agree. I mean, we see this in our members all the time. You know, one of our competitors last week was a company called No App Fee. It was based in Portland, and this guy had been in the hospital for a long time. He'd gotten a check from the government. He wanted to get an apartment. He had the money to do it, but was unable to navigate the bureaucracy of applying for housing. So created an app that actually does that on behalf of the user. So takes the money, finds the open vacancies, ability for low-income housing across the city, matches users to that. I mean, that's a real benefit to the community, to the company, to the user. So, I mean, open data is definitely a huge part of that and is able to help change lives that way.
So what are the challenges in making that data open? How do we get our hands on that data? What are the challenges in opening up accessibility?
I think it's really the regulatory environment. I mean, it's government stopping being government and starting to think of itself as an information hub, which it does in part, but I think there's more ability to open up that information and get it out to users who will actually make good use of it.
Well, you know, for those of us in the app economy, you know, we are the App Association, so we see, you know, thousands of apps coming. The government, I have to give the government some credit. The CIOs of various agencies have gotten together about once a month on an open API meeting that they talk about. But in general, you're dealing with a speed issue. The government transitioning from data captured in a PDF or what amounts to a printout versus them capturing it in a way that is presentable to the outside world. It's not happening quickly. And so I agree with you, there are regulatory hurdles. There are also some odd problems that you don't even think about, which is a government agency might be concerned about HIPAA or privacy laws or other areas where HIPAA is a perfect example. You all know that the iPhone was released in 2007. Any guesses on to when the HIPAA guidance regulation dealing with mobile medical information came out? 2006. So the entire HIPAA ecosystem is now piecemealed, put together, because we haven't had an updated guidance since 2006. Now, they're doing stuff to improve that. I have to give OCR some credit. They are moving in fits and starts there. But 2006, our ecosystem didn't even blossom in 2007. So if you think of it in that kind of range, the government's 10 years behind when it comes to getting this out.
Talk to me a little bit more about the regulatory environment. I mean, both for open source data and for developers who want to rely on open source software. You know, regulators clearly are not keeping pace. So how are you seeing companies navigate that space?
There's two different kinds of companies, right? There's the disruptors who just come in and say, you know, I'm going to do it and you're going to deal with it. And then there's the collaborators, right? So a great example of a disruptor is Uber, who came into Washington, D.C., for example, and blew up the taxi cab system and made, you know, uniform taxi signage, and everyone's able to pay with a Visa now. They did that by disrupting. If they had been, you know, really collaborative, they probably wouldn't be as big or as broad as they are as an institution now. On the collaborative side, you have companies like our member Omada Health, who's based in San Francisco, who is helping manage chronic care, and they have to work very closely with CDC, with regulators, with the health system, with the payers, with the actors, to make sure that their technology is adopted, that they are getting it into the right hands, that it's able to be scaled. So, you know, in their case, they're working with, you know, groups like Humana Health, making sure that the regulatory environment is easily navigated for their product, so that they can get it into the hands of the consumers and scale that way. So they really had no choice but to be collaborative with the different government bodies. And it took them a very long time to figure out who to go to and who needed to do what levers needed to be pulled. But after mastering that, they've been able to be very successful.
I think a lot of it has to do with consumer expectation. I expect that the medical device isn't going to kill me. I mean, I think that's kind of a level set, right? If you're in the healthcare space, don't kill grandma, right? It's a kind of a baseline principle. You laugh, but our industry comes to the world from hey, build it, beta it, fix the problem once you have it. And in healthcare, as you point out, the risk is a lot higher, and therefore some of the need to collaborate is more important. I think that when we look outside of that sector, I think the regulatory barriers oftentimes are things as simple as access to capital. We still have tech companies holding billions of dollars overseas that hasn't come back. That money is the kind of money that helps provide mezzanine financing, that helps provide startups, that helps acquisitions. So in an interesting way, there are regulatory barriers, but that's a perfect example of where billions of dollars would be available for taking greater risk, for helping companies of yours, helping companies of ours reach that next level, but we don't have access to it.
So, I mean, you guys have both talked about healthcare as, kind of a pretty powerful case study for this sort of balance in between the regulatory environment and the need for innovation. Like, are there any other industries or any other sectors that you see as sort of particularly instructive as we sort of talk about this balance in between how to sort of promote and foster innovation in a world in which regulations haven't necessarily caught up?
I think education is one that needs to have some of that happen. We need to have the talent match the need. We also need to make sure that children who have creative ideas have the tools that they need to do it. So a combination of access to information and an access to tool sets. So I think education is a space that is still woefully out of sync with the times. I think financial services, I think the presentation we just saw shows just exactly how quickly that's moving, but I'm sure there are areas there that need some additional support.
Yeah,
that was
strong support.
That was very good.
Nice timing. I think healthcare, education. There are some foundational issues. Transportation, which you hit on, energy. They're the things we know, but we haven't quite figured out where that balance is, and more importantly, how do we disrupt? How do we appropriately engage and disrupt the regulatory environment?
Right. Well, I mean, that's the basic premise of 1776. We are looking at healthcare, energy, education, smarter cities, cyber, food and agriculture. I mean, these are huge, monolithic institutions that are ripe for disruption. And so we're helping guide startups, foster them, mentor them, so that they can actually get in there and create meaningful change.
I guess the one area you mentioned, cyber, and I think it's really important to note that I mentioned the fact the United States is a leader in terms of exporting a lot of our technology. A lot of that relies on trust. No, not a lot of it. All of it relies on trust. And that's incredibly dependent on elements like encryption and privacy and security that make sense, so the consumer knows that their information is safe and in the right hands and held by the appropriate people. And then concomitantly, it means when we sell our products overseas, that our overseas customers understand what we are required to do and what what we don't have to do when it comes to their information for folks who live overseas, whose information is held overseas. I think it's very important that we're able to create a message around trust that they can rely on.
I mean, it seems to me there's got to be a pretty direct tie here with the Privacy Shield negotiations in terms of sort of, again, consumer expectations with open source. Is that a fair link to draw? And what do you see sort of going forward in that area?
I'll let you take that one.
Well, I think it's important that when we talk about consumer expectations about open source, we've been mostly talking about open data. We have to be very careful with this concept of open source having any innate trust framework. Congressman Polis touched on it. Good software, regardless of the license you use, is good software. Bad software, depending on regardless of the license, is bad software. In fact, hundreds of millions of Americans were exposed, and people around the world, through a bug that lived in some open source software for 2 years. And the reason is no one was looking at it. Sure, it was open source, but we had the bystander effect. Everybody went, oh, he's reviewing that code. And before you knew it, it turned out there was only one guy working part-time, and the other 11 people weren't even engaged anymore. And that was the OpenSSL bug. Right. So good software begets safe software good practices beget it. It's not the license, it's how you develop code. And you have companies at 1776 that run the gamut of license choices.
Yes, that is true.
Well, one more quick question. I'm sort of lobbing this at everybody that I speak to today. New administration coming in next year. The environment's obviously going to look, presumably completely different than it does right now. What are some of the sort of issues that a new administration is going to have to face coming down the pike?
I mean, I think that, yeah, okay. I'll take this one. Regardless of who is in the White House come next year, I think they are going to be faced with this major problem, this disruption innovation, and they're going to have to think through, how our government entities are set and where the areas are for disruption and how to help facilitate that in the best way possible to make sure that they don't get left behind. So whether it's a Trump or a Clinton or a Bernie Sanders or whoever, they're going to all have to deal with this. So it's coming. It's a looming issue that they're going to have to
an
think
awareness
about.
issue as much as anything.
It's an awareness, and they're going to have to educate themselves and really understand sort of the ecosystem that we talked about, and make sure that they're surrounding themselves with the right actors, with their regulators, the seated institutions, the startups, the innovators. They all need to come to the table together to really help make good decisions.
And the last area that we haven't touched on at all that's critical to this that administration has oversight over is bandwidth. Mm-hmm. If we don't release more spectrum, our government sits on more spectrum than any government in the world. If we don't release that, then you don't have your amazing app. You can't watch that latest Justin Bieber video when you're sitting there with your smartphone. I know, maybe that's a good thing. Maybe we shouldn't do the spectrum.
No, hang on, let me go cry and I'll be back.
But in all seriousness, we definitely need to make sure that we continue the push for expanded wireless access, especially for rural communities, especially for communities where they haven't had the kind of fiber to the home that those of us on FiOS enjoy, and you see UVerse and other functions like that. So we would be remiss if we didn't realize a lot of America depends on more bandwidth in more places.
Well, Margaret, thank you so much for taking a couple of minutes to talk to me today. And
thank you.
Thanks so much. Thanks, guys. Thanks, Margaret. It is my pleasure now to welcome Congressman Blake Farenthold to the stage.
Good morning.
Good morning. Glad you're here.
Happy to be here.
Well, I will jump right in. Let's, and this is sort of the stage setter that I've asked a lot of people, but what I was hoping you could talk to us a little bit about is the benefits of open source data to government specifically. How does the use of open source data accrue benefit to the American taxpayer? The Joe walking down the street who's just paying taxes every year.
Well, the American taxpayer have already paid for all the data that the federal government has, and making it available to people gives innovators the opportunity to use it. I'm not sure what's going to happen with open data. We're going to throw it out there and let the innovators innovate. And I think that's the beauty of it, is not knowing. Somebody's going to come in and disrupt what we are doing right now and save the government money, come up with some innovation that's going to improve customer service, and for all we know, cure cancer. I mean, anything's possible.
So, I mean, you have a piece of legislation that would make data across agencies sort of open in a readable format. Can you tell me a little bit more about what that bill would do and what that would look like, and how do you sort of bring that to fruition?
Again, I mean, I think it's pretty simple. Just make the data available. You've got all sorts of government data that's just packed away in silos. And we learned, the one thing we really did learn from 9/11 Commission was not sharing data, even among government, is dangerous. Well, if we make the data available in machine-readable formats and well cataloged and centrally located, not only will it provide information to the public, it'll also promote government-to-government sharing. And again, I'm a big open government transparency kind of guy, and I know, and I think it's just intuitive to everybody, the more information you have on anything, the better decisions you can make, and the better opportunity you have to innovate.
So how do you execute that? I mean, that sounds wonderful, but that's a huge project, right? How does that happen in real
You just
terms?
listen, we're never going to go back and get everything cataloged in my lifetime. But as you move forward, you just start making the stuff available. It's just, I mean, we're here in the museum. It used to be all the archives of all the newspapers were in a library where, there's somebody with eye shades and glasses thumbing through drawers to get the clippings. And, now more and more of that information is available online. And the same thing needs to be done with government. And again, it needs to be findable and have some commonality about it, where it's and there are library science folks and computer science folks who can make that happen.
So tell me a little bit about why opening up that data is so important. I mean, what are some of the use cases that you see both sort of within government agencies and then also by sort of the public and by private enterprise?
So Darrell Issa started off with making this, his legislation, the Data Act, making spending information available, so groups like the Sunlight Foundation can determine where the government is spending money. And we're just taking this out and saying, look, if it's not classified information, the default needs to be it's publicly available in a reasonable format.
So how do you go about sort of, if you have lots of different data that's going to be used for lots of different purposes across, different agencies, by private enterprise, how do you go about setting the standards for that data to ensure that it's sort of not only readable but interoperable, it's usable, I guess?
And I'm a radio, television, film major. I'm leaving this to the information science and library people. The bill sets out the aspirations for what we're trying to do, and the details, I think, will sort themselves out.
What about from a sort of security perspective? I mean, there's security risks to sort of relying on open source. What does government need to do to ensure that information is kept safe?
There's security risk in everything. I mean, before I came out here, I emptied my pockets and left my wallet with my chief of staff. I'm hoping he's not on Amazon right now with my.
I think I saw him heading out the back door a few minutes ago.
You've got to be careful. You've got to continue with best practices with respect to data. Really, my big concern is, we're out to publish data. My concern is we don't publish data we shouldn't publish. I mean, that's something that's going to, we don't need to be publishing the list of our spies overseas.
Right.
I mean, there are obvious exceptions to this, but I'm not so concerned about the information that we choose to make public. There's no security really involved in that. But we do have an ongoing security risk throughout government with information. And even information that we do make public, let's take the census data, for instance, all that information is eventually published except the personally identifiable information. So when the census enumerator goes out and gathers your census data, they know who you are so they can check to make sure that they've gotten everybody. So that back-end data does need to be kept secure, but the information where it's anonymized needs to be out there. So there's some intermediate steps, and our whole government-wide cybersecurity issues are big issues. And I mean, I think that's one of the reasons we're looking overall at how the government handles computing. From FITARA forward, it's important we look at it. And I think overall, with respect to privacy and cybersecurity, we need to look at Chairman McCall's bill as well, so we can get the experts in there from both the private sector, the public sector, and advocacy groups to come up with the best plan.
I was going to ask you about Chairman McCall's proposal. I mean, you're obviously a co-sponsor of that legislation. Right. And how does that initiative play a role in shaping some of the policy questions that surround open source specifically?
Well, I think overall in Congress, we do not have the highest level of computer literacy in Congress. You can count the number of hardcore geeks probably on one hand, and computer savvy members of Congress probably are in the, really computer savvy members of Congress are probably in the double digits. Maybe we break 100. But, we've also got our share of curmudgeons.
No, you
well.
guys,
Like,
really?
Where's the dictaphone? And so let me finish. I mean, the McCall Commission, I think the biggest win from that is it's going to be a group of folks that a majority of Congress trust that are going to help educate Congress. And obviously, as time progresses, I think voters are actually looking for some folks who are tech savvy to elect. I mean, we get better service from almost any private sector company that has embraced technology than we do from the government that seems really to push back from technology. I mean, you need to go look no further than the VA that can't figure out how to do something as simple as schedule appointments.
I was, it's been a question for me, is like that, certainly that whole sort of debacle is sort of the only word I can come up for. It has got to.
A national disgrace is what I go with.
has got to sort of push, push lawmakers towards, a consideration of this kind of technology and how it can be leveraged
I think that
in
the
a more effective
consensus
way.
among Congress is give the VA what they need to get the job done. But I mean, there's still a pushback from folks. I mean, a lot of the government is where the private sector was in the 80s and 90s, where people were saying, why do I need to get rid of my IBM Selectric for this personal computer? I mean, that's the way we've always done it philosophy, which I think has been purged from much of the private sector, but has not been purged from the government bureaucracy.
Do you see that as one of the Open Source Caucus's roles? Is education? I mean, how do you sort of go about kind of raising member awareness and government awareness?
You've got to take the opportunity to do it. The way things get done in Congress is you really do persuade other members almost on a one-on-one basis with conversations. But you've also got to have the educational seminars. One of the things we're doing with just in technology in general, my wife is doing social media stuff with the spouses clubs. I mean, we're working every angle to bring the level of technical expertise in Congress up.
So tell me, are there other ways that you see sort of open source being leveraged to improve government transparency, efficiency? Like, what are kind of the main sort of markers of success, and what are some of those pathways?
You look at open source in general, and I was listening to the end of your last panel. Because it's open source, it's easier to get in and look at it security-wise if somebody looks at it. But I see the open source conference or caucus as going almost beyond just open source. It's making not just the software open source, but the data open sourced, and it's a transparency issue. And again, I think as you get teams of people collaborating on things, you'll get results you never possibly envisioned, and you create a system where you're not reinventing the wheel.
Right. Well, I'll sort of lob you this question that I've been asking everyone. The environment changes very, very quickly in technology. In a year, things look different than they do now, and in a year we have, a new administration. What are some of the sort of challenges and issues that a new administration is going to be sort of facing?
I think cybersecurity is going to be our number one issue that we're going to be facing, and I would even take it beyond cybersecurity to cyber warfare. Whether it's an attack on the grid or just what we recently saw in Orlando. Early reports are the shooter in Orlando self-radicalized, a lot of which came from stuff that he was reading online and on the internet. And that's going to create some real challenges for the next administration of where does the First Amendment end when it comes to propaganda from terrorists? Do we say, all right, you've got an absolute right to read whatever you want and interact with whomever you want throughout the world? Or does this terrorist propaganda come closer to being something like child pornography that it's completely illegal to possess? And where are the boundaries of the First Amendment with respect to potentially dangerous online data.
Are there new? Are there going to be new challenges sort of within that sort of this sort of first year of the new administration dealing specifically with the innovation economy, dealing with opening up this data? Like, what do you see as sort of the most immediate new things coming down the pike within the next year?
Again, if you try to predict what technology is going to do, you're going to be wrong. You've got so many people that are smarter than I am, trying to come up with ways to make money, or actually, from one of the questions I asked at a recent Government Oversight and Reform Committee, how are we getting good programmers into the federal government? And you've got patriotic people who are coming to work for the government to protect us from terrorists, to save taxpayer money, to provide more efficient government service, to help people. They're very rewarding data careers in government that we may not be able to pay you the $1 billion you think you're going to make with your startup, but as an opportunity to really help people and shape people's lives, working in technology in the government is going to be, or is not going to be, already is, I think, a rewarding career.
What are some of the ways that sort of government can attract better talent? What can the public sector offer that private industry maybe can't to prospective developers?
I think there's some long-term job security. I think as our millennial generation is growing up and having families, the idea of changing jobs every year is a little bit less appealing. So I think there's an opportunity for some stability there. But I also think that as far as a fulfilling career, public service is. I never thought I was going to run for office, but people ask me, is it fun being in Congress? I go, no, it's not fun being in Congress, but you go home and the days you're not banging your head against the wall, every couple of weeks you go, wow, I made a difference on something. And that's something you get far more regularly in the public sector than you do in the private sector.
Well, Congressman, thank you so much for your time this morning. That brings us to the end of our program for today. On behalf of the Hill and our sponsors, Visa, I'd like to thank you for joining us today. If you missed anything in the program, you can catch the stream. The full video will be up on thehill.com directly. And thanks again so much for joining us today. Cheers. Congressman, thank you so much.